Hi everyone, I'm going to share my screen right now. Let me select
so the last
platform. Yes. Is everything okay? Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic. Thanks everyone. I'm Denis from Inoria, and this is joint work with Alain and Aymeric, and I have the difficult task of doing the last talk of the day, so I hope to keep you awake and entertained, which will be a difficult task. Perhaps some of you have heard about the Catala programming language that has been introduced by an earlier paper at ICFP, but has been also mentioned by other participants. And today I'm going to present an extension of Catala into a proof platform from Delae, implementing ideas that have been evoked in the previous talk, for instance. So just to remind you of the context that has been widely talked about during this day of presentations, there's a lot of legal expert systems in productions, for instance, in government agencies. And as the industrial keynote masterfully laid out, these systems evolve over time and their maintenance and production is a challenge for all the reasons that they've evoked earlier. In light of these observations, which are that most legal expert systems maintained by large organizations are old and poorly maintained, an observation that has also been made in the literature. We also notice that turning law into code requires intense lawyer-programmer interaction. So we believe that, and this has been a key insights into the creation of the Catala programming language, which also meets the fundamental philosophy and requirements of the Oracle Intelligent Advisors in earlier versions. So I'm glad we're converging on this topic, is that we need to mix and match lawyer and programmers in the construction and maintenance of those legal expert systems, that the lawyers and programmers should discuss the same document and build a common understanding of the code that's going to run in order to correctly interpret it. And furthermore, we believe that such a legal expert system source code should be open source, such that lawyers and programmers can collaboratively reach a consensus not only within the same organizations, but across organizations, because the law is unique and is a common good that's decided by Parliament. So its translation into code should also benefit from a kind of consensus in order not to have different interpretations colliding with each other. In this talk, we're going to focus on more open-ended questions, whose direction of research has been presented by Meng Wang in the previous talks. So what are the questions that we want to answer, right? When we're talking about legal verification, meaning applying formal methods to the domain of law. For instance, we can ask whether what are the effects for a legislative change? Is the law ambiguous that it covers all cases? Can we identify legal loopholes ahead of time instead of relying on observing a situation in reality? And all those questions can be tackled in an interdisciplinary fashion with computer science experts and be turned from internal informal questions into formally verifiable properties. And an example which I'm going to give you is in France, the Supreme Court said that the marginal income tax rate should not be higher than 70%. And that can be turned into a theorem, given the tax function T that takes your income I and turn it into an amount of money you owe to government. For all income situation I and additional income that's earned by you, delta I, then the formula, meaning the difference between the new tax and the old tax divided by the difference in income, should not be higher than the ratio of 70%. And this is a property which we aimed to verify for the particular function T that we're going to encode in a programming language such as Catala. So to give you a recap of the gist idea behind the Catala that's been presented in earlier papers, such as the ICFP-21 paper, the basic idea is to write side by side the code and its implementation, which mirrors the system that's been developed by the statute system by the wonderful keynote speakers that they exposed earlier. So, but we're taking more of a less natural language approach and a more, okay, this is just a programming language with verbose keywords approach to this kind of thing. But it's really a convergence here, and I'm really glad to see it. And thanks you for providing insights into this system, which has been in production for a long time. So you can see an example from the US tax code. Let's say that you're defining a qualified employee discount. The details don't matter that much. Then this is what the Catala encoding would look like. And the idea is you just write like what snippet of law and then what snippet of Catala code. And then you go over all the articles of law with little snippets of Catala code. And this constitutes actually your code base that's going to be compiled and executed. So in order for us to reach that goal of proving those complex functional properties like is the marginal tax rates always below 70% for these big code bases of legal expert systems can reach several tens of thousands or even millions of lines of code, then we claim that naively encoding a program P into a proof backend like an SMT solver or a model checker or a deductive verification tool or a proof assistant is not likely to be sufficient for our goals. And we think that because of just the size explosion, we know that automated provers, for instance, are very sensitive to the explosion of the size of the context, rendering them effectively useless when dealing with too large contexts and too large queries. But also that when you mix theories such as nonlinear arithmetic and the theories over lists and the theories over dates, then automated provers, but also manual proofs, it's really difficult to kind of combine all these things together, especially when you throw in like really non-standard features such as default logic, non-monotonic reasoning, which are very not standard in program verification infrastructures that we currently have. So in order to overcome the limitations of this naive strategy, we thought of using a relatively well-known strategy in program verification, which is called proof by refinement. And the gist of it is that you're going to start with a program and apply simplification steps such that you simplify your program in order to have at the end a more simpler, manageable program, but which is semantically equivalent to the original program. And it's on that last program that you're going to do program verification on. And each step of the simplifications will generate a verification condition, which has to be proven for you to state that, okay, the transformation optimization I'm making is actually semantics preserving. It is safe for me to apply that transformation. And when you want to apply the strategy, one of the first things that, and we're going to use that as a case study for the rest of this talk, we're going to use the default term from the Catala language, which has a complicated semantics and which we want to eliminate in favor of a simpler encoding to do verification on. So as a reminder, this is the syntax of default terms. You have a list of exceptions, E1, En, a base case, which is a justification and a consequence. And it has complicated semantics. Please refer to the Catala paper for more details. But basically, we would like to see this term as some kind of nested if-then-else big expression, where the conditions for the expressions can be deduced from the what's actually inside those E1, En. But this is what we would like to translate. But the question we ask is it safe to perform such a simplification on the terms? And our investigation revealed that it is safe to perform such a simplification under the condition that these default terms enjoy some well-behaved execution. And well-behaved execution can be defined formally as the combination of two parts. First, at least one consequence from the default terms should apply at all time. And in the law, it means that when you're defining a variable, you should always there should always be one rule that applies to any given situation. You can't fall into a situation where the system tells you, oh, I don't know what happens. But this is actually difficult because if you remember in the keynote, there's this other and uncertain case that was implemented because in law, certain situations like this can appear. But this is things that we want to reduce and remove. And the second part of well-behaved execution is the absence of conflict, meaning that if you have two exceptions that then could trigger in the same situation and they yield different results for the same variable, well, you want one of them to take precedence over the other. And this has to be justified by legal reasoning. But if you have put those exceptions at the same level, you don't want them to trigger at the same time, because that would be something that's ambiguous and that needs to be resolved. So we claim that with this definition of well-behaved execution, a well-drafted law that doesn't have ambiguities and contradictory statements in it, correctly transformed into a Catala program, should execute in a well-behaved fashion. And so if we're trying to prove that well-behaved fashion, and we find that it cannot be proven for certain variables, and it means that something is wrong either in the translation or either in the drafting of the law, which can inform the people that are either doing the translation or the policymakers themselves. So I'm going to show you a bit of inference rules, because we're at Papal and I need to go into the meaty details, but I'm going to walk you through it. So let's say we want to generate this no empty verification condition, which is the condition at which we can prove that a certain term never returns an empty error. And I'm going to show you, so this has a judgment, meaning that for a term E, we generate an expression EVC, verification condition, and if EVC is true, then E cannot return empty error. And this is how we generate it. So we look at the most emblematic rules for generating the EVC expression, which is like the rule for the default term. So you see that classically we recursively call the generator on the components of the default term, but then we have the following reasoning. The whole default term will never return empty error if the verification conditions for the exceptions, if one of the exception triggers, then it's not going to return empty error. So we do a big disjunction of the verification conditions for the exceptions. And then if no exception triggers, then we have to look at the base case, and then we have to check that the justification never returns empty error. And then if it doesn't, then if the justification is true, then the consequence shall never return empty error. And this is kind of the way we built this generation function. But we have to make sure that the way we generate it is correct with respect to what we intend this verification condition to check. So we have a correctness theorem that states that let E be an expression and EVC the generated verification condition for checking that there is no empty error. Then the theorem which you want to hold true is that for all inputs of E, if the verification condition always evaluates to true, then the expression itself can never evaluate to empty error. And this we can state formally, even into mechanized developments. The proof of this theorem is in progress. We have some ideas on paper on how to do the proof, but we're hoping to do mechanized developments over the next few months to prove that this verification condition generation procedure is correct to what it intends to do. And of course, there are several rules and a similar theorem for the no-conflict part of well-behaved execution, but that has a more complex verification conditions because you have to check pairwise that the exceptions don't collide with each other. So finally, to wrap up this presentation, I would like to state clearly what is implemented at work at the current time and what is left to do as future work. So what's implemented is the generation procedures of the no empty and no conflict verification conditions. We have a basic encoding of the language into Z3 to actually prove these verification conditions, Z3 being an automated SMT solver that's made by Microsoft Research and open source. And we have error reporting and counter examples coming from the Z3 model to help us debug in the case where we can't prove the verification condition. What is left to do as future work is a more complete encoding of all the Catala language into Z3 to handle all kinds of, to make sure that the system works in all situations. But we also want to do the second half of our strategy, which is that if we prove that the verification conditions are correct, then we want to unlock those simplifying optimizations to simplify the program and get closer and closer to our goal of having a simple program on which to do functional verification of complex functional properties. But of course, we've been using only Z3 at the moment, but we want also to diversify proof backends with SMT solver, like other SMT solvers, because they each have their strengths and weaknesses. We want to use proof assistance, maybe abstract interpretation frameworks, etc., etc. And to wake you up at the end of this conference, I will try to attempt a small demo of the current capabilities of the Catala proof platform. You can follow the presentation at the source code at this link, and I'm going to show you. So I have to switch the window. I am okay. So up. If I switch like this, then you should see a screen. Okay. So here, let's say that we're defining the ProLALA'22 and T2 super cache bonus. I mean, it's a bonus that's in the abstract is going to be given at every participant of the conference. And there are simple rules to define who is eligible at that bonus. All students are eligible because they're having a hard time because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this hardship should be rewarded with some bonus. But professors are not eligible, right? Because they have permanent positions and they're doing okay. So if you code this up using Catala, using naively two booleans, one for if the person is a student or not, and one for if the person is a professor or not, then here's an encoding in Catala that you would use. But if you go and put that example into the Catala proof platform, which whose input I've recorded using that neat ASCII NEMA tool that avoids me of running the terminal live, which eventually ends up in a catastrophe. Then what you can see is that if you look at eligibility.isEligible, this is the definitions I was trying to explain to you earlier. It says that this variable might return an empty error. And furthermore, the error message gives you a direct de-encoding of the Z3 model that tells you at which condition, for which values of the input variables you get that empty error. And here, if you say that you're neither a student, neither a professor, then there are no rules that apply in the source code because there's only two rules to give the value of the is eligible boolean. And conversely, if you enter that you're both a student and a professor, then the two definitions are going to trigger at the same time, which will cause a problem, and this is reported by the platform. So the correct way to encode those definitions is actually to with the is eligible correct, which instead of being a boolean is a condition, which is the same thing except that the condition has a false value by default. And this is something that's pervasive through the law. And then you say that if you're a student, then is eligible is true, but then you put an exception that says that if you're a professor, then it equals to false. And here, by using the Catala's exception mechanism, you actually gave a precedence between the two definitions, and combined with the default value to false, if you run the proof platform on the corrected version of is eligible, there's a formal proof that these definitions this corrected definition is well behaved indeed. And this is a example, and we wish to extend it to more real-world use cases in the future, as hinted in the presentation. But we hope that this is sufficient to give you a hint that this actually works, and we are fairly confident to play with it and see if it scales to the real world. And with that, I end this presentation. And I'm curious to see your questions and the discussions that's going to come.
Okay, thank you, Denis. I don't see any questions in AirMeet yet, but we do have a live question here.
Amazing.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So I have a question that's in one of your future work, the second item of your future work, you said about optimization. Can I understand that optimization as requiring every condition to be triggerable by some input?
So it means that if you go back to this slide, basically if for a particular definition you can prove that the no empty and don't conflict verification conditions are true, it means that you would be able to safely transform that default term into this series of lived analysis. This is the kind of optimizations that we want to enable in the Catala compiler. I don't know if it answers the questions.
Okay, I think that's good. There is an Aymeric question. Are you aware of real-world scenarios in which these sorts of verification questions are being answered by humans now, or is this a new capability?
This is a really interesting question, and I think I wasn't able to verify it empirically because this is a question you would ask to legislative drafters. And I do think that legislative drafters have a lot of experience when writing the law of ensuring that the stuff that they define is well behaved according to our definition. So I think that this is already being done, but just manually. And I think the people in legislative drafting office they have to build up that competence, and they put in a lot of hours to check whether this is true or not. And I think that's one of the tool that we're doing is kind of complementary to the work of these people, because they still have to perform a lot of other tasks than just verifying the well-behaved execution. But this is a tool that can help them in their daily work by providing them with another layer of formal guarantee. But that only applies to the small scope of the model that is actually encoding in the program, right? Because the program only computes the amount of taxes, for instance. But there's a number of questions other than the amount of taxes that's encoded in the law and which doesn't enter in the scope of the model.
Okay, I think that's it then. Thank you.